Okay, this is quite an awkward recording. I haven't uploaded a few things at the time of this recording which I had wished to upload. One of them is sort of political and cultural, and another one is sort of a bit psychological and political. And the one that's just political, I guess, is just directed at advice to the opposition party in my country. Um, I mean, the problem is that, sort of the state of culture itself is just in such a bad place, where essentially things have been captured by this cultural hegemon, which one can essentially call, this group hysteria and this, it really takes on the character of a kind of public health crisis that's in the image, roughly, of a kind of collective organism that has borderline personality disorder, or a kind of hybridized cerebral histrionic in the same way that I've sort of described those kinds of things, and as I've defined that particular classification that I've sort of made, and um, I wanted to make some general sort of political and cultural points, continuing to disparage institutions which perpetuate this ongoing dysfunction in terms of journalism in general, the institution of journalism essentially being dead, which effectively renders democracy effectively dead, because you can't really have a functioning democracy when you don't have sort of public discourse and sense making that's happening on a collective scale, but essentially free speech has been curtailed and has been reined in by this sort of ideological totalitarian obsession with identity, and the kind of dichotomous thinking that identity politics demands and expects, which is being fed by journalism, essentially then renders it, just a kind of a propagandist engine for essentially more identitarian, dogmatic fear mongering and such, and sort of creating these really toxic polemics, which are a perversion of the phrase social justice, which in the South African Constitution, social justice means protection for the individual against society, not the protection of some generalization of a group against another generalization of another group, which has so many levels of reductive oversimplification that it's so morally corrupt, which is why essentially you can have rich black plutocrats using black empowerment as a shield for their ongoing corruption, which becomes undetectable in this disgusting and corrupt cesspool of morality, which should not be called morality. It is essentially it's a totalitarian ideological. It's the culture of fascism. It's that kind of pseudo intellectualism, and now journalists or activist journalists, um, yeah. Anyway, they're sort of like the Grand Dragon Wizards in the KKK. They're little bastions of their cultish way of thinking, and who knows when we'll see the culmination of these sorts of cultural things into disgusting phenomena, like the Nastasi and the Gestapo, and sort of underground brown shirt operations and things like that, because that's essentially the culture of the runaway plutocracy, which is unable to ever regulate itself, because it's such a murky, opaque, superficial virtue signaling. Any elite can get by just by virtue signaling to the mob, uh, uh, idolatry of identity. Anything can be reframed as an identitarian. You can disguise anything that you want. There's an endless possibility of malfeasance, which is unstoppable essentially. Um, and essentially the only guarantee that you're given in exchange for this new form of a liberal politics is just that, okay, well, your identity will be sanctified by this new order. That's it. So your identity will get stronger, while the individuals will languish under a more disgusting, tyrannical, unaccountable form of plutocratic corruption, which we can see, we've got examples of this in the press, and journalism doesn't do its function of looking into this. But anyway, what was it? So the thing that I wanted to talk about was the construct covert borderline, and I needed to make some revisions about that. So when I was talking about it, I was correct in what I said, but some of the words, I know, or anyway, I'm going to sort of neaten it up, I guess. So when Sam Vaknin originally introduced this and started talking about it, he didn't use the word idealized. He used the word perfect feelings, perfect emotions, and his description, although it seems more quaint, is actually more apt than when I said idealized, because idealized is a very general term. And so when I said that, these are idealized feelings, I was just also using that to try to express the point that although it's a subjective perfection, the perfection really is a mark of how untouchable they are, of how morally secure they are in their feelings, in the certitude of their feelings and the correctness of their feelings, and the correctness in applying their feelings, as it were. But obviously, put this in a slightly different way, you can say that subjectively they're perfect to them, obviously. Now, in some sense, the thing when I say that they're idealized, that doesn't quite have the same connotation that perfect does, and perfect has the correct connotation in this context. That if I say that they're idealized, that they think that they're perfect. Basically, the point. What I'm just let me just summarize this as to the consequences of what I'm trying to say. So what I'm trying to say is that these people are very hypocritical. They are very sanctimonious in a kind of actually it's quite conspicuous, their sanctimoniousness, but you can tell that they are managing things on behalf of their kind of objective metaphysics, that they have a kind of that they are the voice of moral certainty, and moral authority sort of vests with them. And in some sense it's more than that. They actually do see themselves as agents of the divine, or rather agents of the divine order, or of the moral order, that they are the purveyors. And so in some sense, there's a character in fiction, this is a bit embarrassing to talk about, but there's this series called The Originals, which is about vampires and stuff like that. And the themes in that are very, very good. Anyway, I'm not going to elaborate further on that, but why they're good. But anyway, good writing. Even if the actual sort of the human drama is a bit melodramatic and sort of repetitive, it's a very. I mean, well, what do you expect from writing? I mean, what do you expect from series? What do you expect from works of fiction? You want to see inner workings of the soul, as it were, and really, a lot of those themes are exploring these constructs. They really are. It's sort of The Originals, you could say, is a bit of an example of cluster B symptomology. Is all around. That's what The Originals is about. It's about cluster B stuff to some extent. Obviously, it centers on the three main vampires more than the other ones in some sense, but it shows you nice little aspects of different sort of things, and some of the important characters that are at the core. It's interesting because they exhibit things. Obviously, you can't see them so clearly from the inside, but you can see them from the outside. And I would say that Victor, I think his name is Victor, the father of the Originals, is a covert borderline. And he and the archetype that I'm just drawing from this, because I mean narcissism, I think is a very good. Vampires are narcissistic, fine, or actually, well, actually, I've actually used borderline. Actually, whenever I talk about borderlines, I often talk about vampirism. And the kind of vampirism I've even used from the Originals, like how the vampirism works in that world, and how you get a sireship when you make a vampire. They become prone to being controlled by you. That's a very sort of borderline. Okay, so anyway, I guess it's more borderline. they're narcissistic. But obviously they're huge narcissistic components to borderline anyway. And I even went into that. I mean, whenever I describe borderline, I'm describing narcissism at the same time. Anyway, moving on. Victor is described, and I don't know. In some sense, it's much easier to see covert borderline from the outside than from the inside, because the inside, I've already described what it looks like from the inside, with the mesh models of the inner child, how they have got two vanities, and that's somewhat complicated, and therefore they can create their own sort of belief structure to fit the mold of what they might need in order to help project power in their subconscious deployment and manifestation. Anyway, I'm not going to go into those details so much. I just wanted to focus on this one thing. Victor is described as a vampire hunter in some sense, because he actually is a vampire, but he doesn't feed off of humans, he feeds off of other vampires. And this is exactly how covert borderlines function. They see themselves, in some sense, as the kingpin, and of, in the same way that I've described that Hitler was a covert borderline. And in some sense, they really do give themselves a kind of pseudo-religious role in some almost material sense, that that their presence keeps order among that they feed off of the people that feed off of other people, that they are kind of like the purveyors of the narrative in some sense, that they are the pillars and the source of the story that is being told in some sense, that they are the progenitors, that they are the forefathers really of the whole sort of the cluster B sort of thing. Because of their ability to effectively acclimatize to it, but also to sort of to manage it into some extent. In the same way that borderlines want to control other people's subconsciousnesses, they already have a controlled subconscious, and the covert borderline, in some sense, is trying to get other people to actually, they want to imprint on other people's inner child. They want to actually feed off of other people's inner childs. They want to break them down and make them commensurate, and make them also, well, I mean, in some sense, because their structure of their vanity is so malleable that they need somebody else to be permissive to that, which actually requires a huge amount of almost, in an unconscious sense, that their inner child will have to be in a kind of permanent psychosis. They need their prey to be in a kind of permanent psychosis in terms of their inner child workings. So they want someone with a very highly sophisticated or even brittle ego function and a very nebulous inner child, or malleable inner child. Now that's almost the definition of a child, So you can sort of see that they see themselves as an adult and everyone else is a child in the room. That's actually a very good summary of a covert borderline. That's exactly how they come across, and they will do these weird because how they test people, or not how they test people, but how they sort of impress themselves against in terms of trying to suss out the structure of other people's inner child so that they can start to fiddle with it and start to mess with it, is that they will use a kind of superego subversion. So they will often create these weird sorts of juxtapositions. In the same way that a borderline is very subconsciously disorientating, a covert borderline is very disorientating and subversive on the level of the superego. And so they are fucking with people using their superego, and already the superego essentially is incredibly corrosive and to someone's ego function. People naturally have a natural aversion against their superego, because essentially it will, any kind of prominence that exists within the ego function, because of the natural or the ordinary, not natural, but the ordinary disintegration that usually will occur on some level between the inner child and the subconscious will result in a mirrored or a reflected um, uh, uh, intellectual inconsistency in the ego function. And so those ego function inconsistencies will usually be rationalized by the ego function in some sense of a prominence in some regard. Will be a kind of a sacred cow. Will be some kind of moral certitude that is premised in some kind of exterior authority or some kind of narrative story or something like that. And so they will try to fuck with the narrative by essentially trying to get the superego to, in some sense, they might almost be trying to sort of mess with the false ego contract itself, or the false prophet in the superego. So they're sort of they're trying to almost commensurate, or they're trying to get a kind of compatriotism from the false prophet in the superego, and against the inner child, and so they're trying to play a kind of meta physician in a kind of they're almost saying, okay, well, that's great, you're doing all these complicated things. Now, can you actually um, can you produce a double? They will force you to try to produce a double standard on the level of your inner child, essentially. And in fact, they will. Now, when I say that, what it actually means the opposite, but what I said is exactly true. So what they will do is they will try to take your inner child hostage by forcing you not to appear to have a double standard. So they'll take the integrity of your inner child hostage by asking you questions or propositioning you. In some sense, it's usually much more direct because the superego is itself a very sort of in your face. So it won't be in the form of a question necessarily, or I mean, it'll be a predicament. It'll be some kind of predicament. It could take the form of a question, but it'll be a kind of a confront. It will be a real scenario which they will have crafted. That'll be real. It'll be a real experience that will have a kind of juxtaposition, or it'll have some kind of conundrum built into it, baked into it, in which essentially, um, if you do one thing, then you'll prove that you're not creating a double standard. So that at the risk of creating a double standard in your inner child, they will try to compel you to walk a certain line or something like that. And if you fail their test, then essentially that gives them the moral certitude to just disregard everything that you said and just supplement it. And so essentially, um, supplement it with their own process of their own sort of structure, which operates as it does, with its weird kind of duplicitousness of being able to sort of create their own sort of concocted perfect feelings and things like that, because the foundation in the inner child is just like that is their building material, and they're used to just sort of constructing that as they so please. It's just like it's just mud, it's just slush, it's just um, anyway. Uh, because essentially they've got this pact between their superego and their subconscious. That is, they're like a subconscious focused structure, but between the but they have to, the only way to sort of to create that prominence in their subconscious that they have is by being able to change their foundation at will in order to keep that fixed target in their subconscious. Um, so in some sense, the subtext of what they're doing is fully is just slush. It's just jelly. It can just be just takes on a new mold. They can just and whatever mold that they do, they just keep the same subconscious sort of chessboard. So they can freeze the chessboard, but they can change the color of the squares underneath all the pieces. um, to mess with the rules. That's a good analogy in terms of covert borderline. That they have the pieces are where they are, but they can change the color of the squares that the pieces are standing on top of, and therefore, and then they can wreak havoc playing with the rules in that way, and then they can sort of, and then while they try to sort of diminish other people's inner child, so that they can't keep track of what color the squares should be underneath everyone's feet. Um, so they are using this confusion. They're trying to exteriorize or get other people. Okay, anyway, why was I saying all this stuff? And essentially, their best target is kind of like a narcissist, or because no, uh, their best target is someone who has ego function structures which they don't want to divorce themselves from. Because in some sense, people can still have their ego function structures, but then they're forced to root them in, let's say, the covert narcissist subconscious field. But the subconscious wants to control the squares, the color of the squares. So they want to keep people in the ego, while they essentially want to disorientate the inner child um, through the vector of the superego, whereas a normal borderline wants to disorientate the inner child through the vector of the subconscious. Um, anyway, okay, there are probably details, but anyway, but it was just interesting because essentially describing Victor as the vampire hunter, um, the vampire of vampires. Um, and so ideologically, they would be the kind of the natural political leaders of the kind of psychological mess. So these would be the kinds of, I mean, they're psychopathic in their own way. They're very hypocritical. That was the thing that I wanted to point out, is just how hypocritical these types of people are, because although they can be held to a kind of ego function fidelity in terms of consistency, in terms of their ego function, their consistency is just so insane because it has no fidelity. So essentially, they keep their consistency by just redefining words in the same way. So it's like the story will seem to always be a sequitur story. It'll always be a consistent story, but the consistency is bought at the incoherence of the meaning of the words themselves. So the definition of a single word will take on many definitions, and they have this kind of um, uh, uh, there's a logical fallacy that sort of describes this. Where you seem to have made, sort of well enough constructed syllogisms, but you actually are using different definitions of the same word in order to accomplish it. I can't remember, but anyway, is basically that is what they need to function with, and so they are always conditioning their target into being able to essentially take that kind of retroactive revision. They're always trying to test people if they are capable of complying with that kind of retroactive revisionist subversion, which is effectively completely dismantling and disintegrating the structure of the inner child, so that it just becomes a kind of nebulous mass, or a kind of amorphous spawning ground for more, in order to support the crazy environment that the covert narcissist is sort of creating, which is the covert border. I did say covert borderline. The covert borderline is creating, which is in some sense a kind of, it's a very electrical kind of at war, sort of like a sort of clan warfare in some sense, but of an inner of a very sort of inner circle, a very kind of occult kind of. Um, the other thing to be said about this, I was going to make political points about just about how much people are giving into the mob and how divided they are, trying to pander to the fake morality that the mob is based on, to try to win some sense of credibility with the mob, so they can sort of, I guess, so they can feel like they will always be able to sort of debunk them. I guess they're sort of trying to keep their inroad. They're trying to keep an inroad or a communication line open with the mob, so that if they ever came with them, they would be able to sort of hold their ground, and say that, well, look, even within, your buzzwords and your things, I can actually use those words, and I'm using them consistently and you're using them inconsistently. But sort of having to sort of mirror that is an arbitrary sort of requirement, in some sense, that you have to sort of, you're placing a prominence on certain arbitrarily selected semantics just because they're used by the mob, in some sense. And when you do this, in some sense, this forces you to create false conflicts with people that you don't have a real disagreement with, or you have other disagreements with them which you can't get to, because you're forced to be apart based on, let's say, the inconsistency between how you use that word, which you're using as a buttress or as a protection against the mob, and other people are using the word differently because they have different beliefs, but they're also antithetical to the mob, and they also, but and and I just want to point out in general that people are way too critical of President Trump. President Trump is doing a superhuman job in terms of the culture war. No one could do what he is doing because of his intuitive way of communicating, because he doesn't get into the specifics. He can cut through a lot of this, let's say, hyper realism red tape, and just get down to the brass tacks, just get down to reality, and people can still argue about politics and reality because he's involved in it and because of how he communicates. So people can still talk about the issues. You can still have liberal politics. You can still have democratic politics. And I mean democratic with as in the democratic system um, of government and politics. You can still do that because President Trump is the president, and he doesn't feed into this totalitarian ideological confection of reality, and oversimplification and generalization versus versus other generalizations, which create this endless corruption. But because essentially, because some people want to sort of win some currency with the mob, I guess, so that they can maybe use that currency to help defend themselves in their particular sort of things, they have to say egregious things about President Trump that in some sense don't even make sense. They're just part of these disgusting word associations. Oh, President Trump used this word, which was used historically by racists. That it's on that kind of level of guilt by absolute hypothetical association. And I see people doing this, and it's and I've heard even I've heard it even being explained, I think, by Eric Weinstein, that Sam Harris says anti-Trump things on purpose to try, essentially, because he doesn't want people who are supporters of Trump to become part of his audience or something like that. He's almost doing it. He's doing it too much. He's doing it because he wants to sort of. He doesn't want to be called a right wing pundit or something like that. He wants to keep his left wing credentials. Anyway, I just wanted to point out that it's these kinds of argumentation. It's these kinds of, okay, well, what is the mob hysterically bawing about today, and then trying to give a kind of intellectual sympathy to what it is that they're saying, so then you can make your more nuanced point. That's what I see Brett Weinstein doing all the time. And Eric is too sympathetic to, I don't know, people who are in some left wing echo chambers, or whatever. They're just. I think the whole coronavirus thing has been a tremendous eye opener in terms of journalism. I mean, it isn't understood. The interpretation I'm about to give is not widely understood to be the common sense sort of interpretation, but I'm just going to give it my take on it anyway. It's quite obvious that all this. Look, if you're not in a context in which it's possible to track and trace every single case and actually eradicate it, if you can't eradicate it, which cannot be eradicated in the West, there is no point in caring about that there are too many cases. The only definition of too many cases is that the hospitals are overfull. That is the definition of too much. Having an increase in cases, this is a good thing. It must take its natural course. You cannot stop the virus from taking its natural course. You can only protect a minority of people. It's only possible to protect a minority. You need to work out what the minority is. You need to work out who are the vulnerable population, and they need to self lock down and self segregate and self social distance. They need to know who they are themselves, and they need to make themselves less prone to getting the virus, and then everyone else who isn't part of that self-selecting minority needs to actually just do everything as normal as possible and spread the virus as much as possible, because most people who have it won't even know that they have it because they'll have such mild symptoms or none at all. And we need to get through it as soon as possible, because the faster that we get through it, then it'll be safer for the minority to come out of the hiding. That is the only intelligent way of managing this. The only way that you want to have a lockdown is if it looks like that your hospitals are being overfilled, and you can't actually absorb, if your medical resources can't actually absorb the inflow. But essentially, I mean, you had hospitals overfilling in 2002 SARS outbreak, and it just happens over a certain period, and it just naturally it only happened. The crunch only happened in over you know medical resources were stretched, but the only point sort of that it exceeded capacity was only for a small period of time, and they generally sort of coped in 2002. And in fact, if we compare this to 2002, we will see historically that the 2002 SARS outbreak was way worse than coronavirus now. If we do, obviously we'll have to do some statistical things, because now, because it's a media sort of pundit instrument for fear mongering and for creating hysteria. We've got all these different ways of counting death, and that's not taking into account comorbidity. But if we take certain ways of measuring to sort of even those things out, we will find that the 2002 SARS outbreak was way worse than this coronavirus. This coronavirus is way less bad in many respects to the 2002 SARS outbreak. So yeah, a lot of this is really, I mean, the idea that, cases are going up, we need another lockdown. I mean, what sort of insanity is this? Why are you delaying the inevitable? It doesn't. Why do you want the cases to go down? It has to take its natural course. The only way that you want the cases to go down is if your plan is eradication. The plan is not eradication. That's impossible. So what the fuck are you talking about? It's absolutely insane, the most unintelligent, uninformed bullshit. But I mean, this is the kind of journalism that I mean, because the journalists have been inclined towards this fascistic hyperrealism because they're used to battling generalizations like white privilege and talking about systemic oppression. So it falls into that category of just absolutely senseless, hysterical nonsense. It's the same formula of irrationality and just abject, where has intelligence gone? Where has investigative journalism gone? I mean, the only country that has done things responsibly is Sweden. The only thing that happened bad in Sweden was that it got into the nursing homes, but that had nothing to do with their general public. Um, that had to do with it that they weren't doing hygiene properly in the nursing homes. That when they were treating one person with the flu, they weren't doing hygiene when they went to go treat um, the other patients, and so the coronavirus was spreading inside the nursing homes because I guess people that look after old people, those places aren't run by the highest caliber intellects, I guess, or something like that. That's bad management at the nursing homes. That's got nothing to do with their general public health strategy. And yes, in overall they've had more cases, but that's because then 70% of their population now has already had it. So if you want to say, oh, you want to compare cases in one country with cases in another country, well, what's the point? Because yes, there have been more cases in Sweden. Well, in the other country, it's only gone through 20% of the population. So they still have all their work. They're still going to have the same number of cases probably overall. They're just going to have a slower spread, which is actually far worse in general. You don't want it to spread slowly. You want it to spread quickly because that will give the virus much less opportunity to mutate. If you extend the duration, the actual, because if it's an inevitable thing that it has to work its natural course through the population, you're giving it more time to to finish with one person, start with the next person, and then and because the slow because the contagion is spreading more slowly. So now you've just increased the total duration that it inhabits a human host from the one virus lived in one person, and then right at the tail end it may be spread to the next person, then right at the tail end it's spread to the next person. That same virus has had more hours living inside of a human being. It's had more opportunity to mutate dangerously. And yes, flus. Look, this is the nature of human existence. We have diseases that affect us. And in some sense, because of travel around the world, we've actually, I mean, I believe in Professor Gupta's interpretation from Oxford that actually public health has been improved in some sense. We used to have influenzas because people used to be so isolated. A flu would enter into a population and it would be deadly. And so every 20 years there'd be a deadly flu and it would just kill many, many people. But because of international travel, the flus get around so quickly that people have actually there. We don't get these isolated flu events where people have not had the flu in so long, and then they get exposed to a flu that they've never seen before, and it just decimates them because it's much more fluid and it enters the system. We've been exposed to more different flus, and it's been better. Our immune systems don't get the shock of a novel of such a novel flu all the time. So I know in general public health we don't have the 20-year deadly flus that we used to have. So we should be grateful. Like things are much better than they used to be. So actually, yes, disease is bad, but actually everything is actually up and up. This is way better than things used to be. I mean, if we just have one deadly flu every what's it been now? And this I wouldn't even call a deadly flu. This is nothing like the Spanish flu. This is much less deadly. This is less deadly than the 2002 SARS outbreak. There's another thing that needs to be said about this. I mean, people don't know enough general knowledge about health and stuff like that. But immunity, like the idea that people have immunity and then this doesn't confer, they have all this hypothetical bullshit to justify the narrative being peddled by to rationalize these unintelligent strategies from politicians. We don't know if antibodies confer immunity or something like that. Okay, well, first of all, you have to take what you know about the family of the virus, and we know that SARS viruses, you get immunity, and the immunity usually is pretty good. It lasts about 5 years, so that's fine. And that would have been good enough to work off of, and that's why all the advice from the real experts and from the people who actually got their way in Sweden, who has the only intelligent way of dealing with this virus, um, you know, we're, we're not trying to let the virus do anything else than take its natural course. Um, uh, but the point that needs to be stressed as well is that immunity is not a binary. You're not immune or you're not immune. Immunity doesn't mean that you can't get it again. Immunity is in the same, actually, it's very similar to the concept of herd immunity. Herd immunity doesn't mean that people can't get it. It just means that if you get infected, it's not going to spread across the whole population. It's going to be maybe a little isolated pocket or something like that. And it's going to be contained by the herd immunity. Immunity is really should just be called resilience in some sense, although these also have there are actual terms, and resilience is not this. Resilience is also something different to immunity, and resilience is also a different sort of thing. There are other factors and forms of resilience, which many other different processes or whatever. But essentially, immunity is not. There's no such thing as pure immunity. If you have something that would classify as immunity, you can still get that virus instantly. It just very, very unlikely, and it really has to do with your exposure to more viral load. How big is the viral load? If you get enough exposure to a virus with immunity, you can still be reinfected. Immunity is not perfect binary. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you can find incidents of one person that has been reinfected. That doesn't mean that antibodies don't confer immunity. It's the same. It's like herd immunity. This is biology. It's a bit. It's not. It's not. It's not white or black. It's not all or nothing. Um, just common some just basic understanding of anything. But journalism doesn't go into this stuff because journalism is used to just peddling narratives about generalizations because that's what they've been taught with their totalitarian ideology of identity politics and identity pandering, because that makes the world easy to understand. It makes it easy to make prescriptions, makes it easy to tell people what to do, and that's what the world that we have now inherited, and obviously it's quite disgusting. We live under these conditions, and that we live with such sort of poor journalism and unintelligent politicians that essentially are only accountable to mob sentiments and mob values and things like that. Okay, anyway, that's the end of my recording. That's kind of everything I wanted to cover. Yeah, that is everything I wanted to cover. I guess I don't even know what to call this. I've got politics, culture, and psychology in this, and it's all mishmash, so that's actually quite horrible. But anyway,